that you're gonna look great.
But if you wanna stay in shape, well, you better hit the
GymWits, GymWits.
That's right, man. Tell 'em. Welcome to the GymWits podcast. I'm Ryan George.
I'm Justin Guild, a.k.a. Chef Sonic.
And we are the GymWits.
So this is going to be sort of the last time I see you for a little while, right?
Yeah, but we keep saying it.
No, but this is actually the time.
Yeah, but we keep saying it. So, and depending on the order that I, choose to post these, it's going to sound so confusing to everybody because it's going to be like every week I'm going away and people go, when is he going away? And then by the time I'm actually back, I'll actually be back. So I never will have gone away.
But as far as I'm concerned, this is going to be the last time I see you for a while.
So in real time, real world, this is likely the last time you'll see me for 5 weeks. However, I will be back in a couple weeks.
I'll see you backstage.
I'll be back twice. you think? I'll be back twice. And once will be for 2 days, which I will try to get time to see you, although my wife obviously is the priority. And then the next time I'll actually be back on Comic-Con weekend in October. I'll be here Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So we may be able to get some recording time. So yes, It's like 5 weeks that I'll be mostly out of the city, but I'll be back a couple times. So you might be able to see me. So it may not seem like that much time that I'm away.
All right.
But yes, today is technically again, our listeners over the next, God, it's so confusing with all the posting and everything, but we'll have heard us discuss my leaving for months now. And this is the actual real world last time. Yes.
And it might get released after you get back.
Exactly. So
probably not.
Probably not. Only because this is an episode I've been wanting to get out for a while because we had a request for it.
Oh yes.
So
and about that,
what?
I'm actually Ryan called me to tell me about the episode. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't really hear what you were saying very well. The phone was breaking up, but I'm proud of you for coming up with an episode that I can really get into, if you know what I mean. So I heard some of the talking points. You talked about size, shake, pump, all these sorts of of cool things. So
that's what you took out of the show notes. You really went through those show notes.
So
you're like.
Tell everyone what the episode is on.
Gaining mass.
Mass.
Yes.
Oh yeah, of course. Mass. All right. Okay. Well, let's roll with it anyway. So,
wow. That was not good. Not your best work. But I don't have a lot of time, so we're not going to re-record that intro. So anyway, yeah. So to give a little bit of an intro, we had somebody ask about building size, right? And building muscle mass, which is a goal that many of us have, even people who don't know it. Like we, have a lot of women, female clients will say, I want to get toned, but I don't want to, put on muscle. And you still probably want to put on a little bit of muscle. You just don't want to look like, a massive bodybuilding guy or bodybuilding girl. So today we'll go into kind of some of the information, some of the science, some of the research, what are the parameters that you can work with when trying to build size, and Justin will work with me. So why don't you ask me the first question? What do you want to know?
All right. So let's just sort of strip it down because I've gone through the phase 2 where I wanted to get big. But what are we talking about when we say the term building mass or building size or getting bigger?
It's pretty simple. It's just it's hypertrophy, which is simply kind of increasing the cross-sectional area of the muscles, right? So it's a fancy way of saying, growing the muscles. And that's it. So when we're talking about that, that's building size. That's everybody kind of has the right idea there, when you're building. And today we're going to focus on muscles. Obviously, there's there's tendons and ligaments which can tend to some extent can grow slightly, but not nearly at the rate or scale of the muscles. So we're going to kind of focus on that. But the way it works, which is kind of the second kind of part of this, is. It's a little tricky. So with a lot of these things, we think they seem simple and we think we know. This happens with all kinds of science or things that you think are simple, think are pretty straightforward, but really turns out that scientists aren't 100% sure. And so when the kind of, even with hypertrophy, they're not 100% sure. So what we generally know is, pretty simple, like the Planet Fitness ads, right? You pick stuff up, pick stuff up, put it down, and the muscles grow. And, there is a cause and effect with that. And some people grow bigger, some people grow smaller. But essentially...
how can you grow smaller?
I'm sorry. Some people grow bigger. Some people grow at faster rates than others.
Yes,
I'm sorry. Yeah, I need to speak slower. I need to
It
stop.
would be cool if you could grow smaller.
It's called atrophy.
Yes. I guess
So, yeah. So the kind of prevailing theory is, exercise causes micro trauma to the muscles. Basically, again, fancy way of saying damage. So these kind of microscopic tears in the muscle. So that's kind of part one, right? You lift weights, and that causes this damage to the muscles. The body then responds by repairing and increasing the size of the muscle cells in order to adapt to the new stress. So basically, it's kind of a stress response. If you're lifting a weight or performing an activity that is more stressful or strenuous than you're used to, the body's going to react by saying, okay, well, this is new. I'm going to need to adapt to that new size. And so it builds itself, in theory, bigger and stronger in order to adapt to those kind of the new stressors. Right?
Okay, so this sort of, it adapts to, as you said, it adapts to the stressors by getting bigger or getting stronger, some combination. But it seems like when you're, I'm at the gym like I was earlier, and I was doing heavy weights and doing deadlifts and back stuff, and I was like all pumped up right there. But I know that it doesn't work that fast. It's not like I just lift weights like, oh, my muscles are bigger, but it looks like it.
Yeah, so that's kind of an acute reaction, right? It pump. Right, we all know the pump you get when you lift weights. If you're gonna go out, I remember going out, we'd grab some weights and start lifting, try to get a little pumped up before. That's different. So that just comes from increased blood flow, right? So you let's say wherever you lift, again, you're creating that damage. So the idea is, right, the body's gonna then increase blood flow to those areas. So let's say if you're working your arms, you're increasing damage to the arms. The body, responds by increasing the blood flow to the arms. You get that little swelling, pumped look, and you go out and you look a little bit bigger. That's different from the actual adaptation, which is kind of called myofibrillar hypertrophy, which is, again, increasing the, at a really microscopic level, increasing the contractile proteins, which you call actin and myosin, which kind of, they work together to actually make the muscle fibers contract. There's another kind of hypertrophy called sarcoplastic, but it's kind of, the increase in the glycogen storage within the muscles, but that's kind of disputed as far as whether or not, that is a significant kind of cause of your getting bigger. And really, you don't need to know either of these. You just need to know that you need to know what's more important when we're getting into this is really, the parameters and what you should be and shouldn't be doing, in order to kind of get that adaptation. Right? Make sense?
Yeah. And I know a little bit about this as well. Not certainly not as much as you, but I've been reading, the magazines for a while. So, I don't know. I think a lot of us that are into lifting weights have sort of done a nominal amount of research into wondering why this actually happens. So, I guess that the question that I've always had is, what are sort of, I know that clearly the lifting weights and how much you're lifting weights, but what are the sort of other variables to why you're going to grow? Because I know that you could you pick it up and put it down, but I know that there has to be so much more that goes into it.
Yeah, so there are a number of variables that do affect how somebody grows. Okay, so they include gender, hormones, age, genetic makeup, your sleep, your diet, medication. There are any number of variables that will affect.
That's so funny. You were never even thinking that as kids. You're just thinking, I'm going to lift weights and I'm going to get big. It's like, and I guess you probably figured, maybe people are genetically better. But I guess there's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it. So, we're not going to focus on all of those variables as much, only because that would take, that would be a 3-hour podcast. And each one, as we just recorded, I don't know where it's going to be released in relation to this episode, probably before, but we just did that great episode on sleep. And, we could probably spend a whole episode just talking about how sleep is going to affect your,
now,
building your muscles.
Our listeners going to have heard the sleep episode by the time this comes
probably,
out.
Yeah.
We should
but, even like genes, genetics is another thing where we're working, actually talking with somebody. I know we touched on it also in another episode, but we actually have an expert. I don't want to not say the other person didn't know what they were talking about. We have somebody who really is a doctor studying this. So we're going to talk about genes and how they affect you. So these are all, in and of themselves, when it comes to hormones, genes, sleep, diet, etc. Those are all things that almost require their own, discussion, but we will touch on some of them. Like I think we'll touch a little bit on gender differences and age differences, and how that can affect building size. But yeah, those are all things. So it's important to know that it's not just how much you lift and how much you don't lift. But also, all these other factors. I'm sorry, I'm like distracted by the sounds of New York. Justin's got some massive construction going on outside of the studio, and along with traffic and stuff. But anyway, so I guess what's your next question?
All right, so you always hear someone saying, "Oh, look at that guy, he looks really strong." Mm-hmm. And look, we know to a degree, if you're a bodybuilder, you're not weak.
Yeah.
Right. Or maybe in certain parts, if you have like an injury or certain parts, you might be weaker, or there might be some imbalances. But we know, look, if you can bench press 600 pounds, you're not weak. It would be hard pressed for anyone to say that someone who could do that is weak. But with that being said, what is the correlation between size and strength? Because you've seen athletes that are like really, really strong, but they're not necessarily as big. Yeah. So what is the correlation there?
So clearly, anybody that tells you, oh, size doesn't mean anything, look at, okay, give a quick example. If you look at guys that kind of compete in the world's strongest man competition, and then you look at them compared to some of the biggest bodybuilders in the world, the bodybuilders are going to be larger, have more defined muscle, but they're not going to necessarily win a world's strongest man competition. You will have some that will cross over. So I think there is but you'll get people who will take that and leap into saying, oh, bodybuilders aren't that strong. Size doesn't mean anything. Its strength is different from size, and that's not right. Like clearly, bodybuilders are strong, and clearly, the larger you are and the larger the size of your muscles, there is a very distinct correlation between size and strength. Now that being said, there are differences. And so, the strength adaptations don't necessarily mean the same kinds of size adaptations. So, if your goal is to be as big as possible, you're going to have to lift heavy, but your goals are going to be different from somebody who wants to be as strong as possible. And, we'll get a little bit into the, more specifics, but, a good example of this would be 3 to 4 weeks of inactivity will cause the muscles to atrophy. Right, so atrophy, we just said, is when the muscles get smaller. Right, but that decrease in size doesn't lead to an equivalent decrease in strength. Right, so the correlation just isn't there. Right, if you don't work out, let's say you deadlift 400 pounds today, and you don't work out for 4 weeks, you may get, or let's take a more specific, let's say bicep curl. Let's say you curl 30 pounds, and then you don't work out for 4 weeks. Your biceps might atrophy slightly, but it won't atrophy at the rate that your strength will decrease. Your strength will relatively remain, the same. So, that's one example. We'll also discuss there are different, depending on the weights that you use, your body's going to adapt different. And so there are a variety of ways to gain size, right? And we'll talk more about that, where to gain strength, there really is only one way, and that's lifting, heavy and lifting and producing, maximizing kind of the recruitment of muscle fibers for whatever the movement is. So, strength is its own thing that generally does lead to bigger size, but they're not directly correlated. They're not like a parallel line between the two, that as you get stronger, you're going to get bigger.
And of course, there's I'm sure we'll get into this later, but there's a big dietary component to size. Basically, if you want to get bigger, you have to eat more, you have to put in more calories.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, all right, in relation to the size, I heard a lot about this when I was first getting into weightlifting. At the gym, people would always say, oh, you want to do the lifts this way right? Or you want to hit the angle of your muscle
Yeah.
because it'll shape it. Or if you do more reps, it'll get the muscle will point out rather than getting bigger in general. And I think we know that that's sort of a myth,
Yeah.
that it doesn't really work like that.
Yeah.
So could you just talk a little bit about trying to shape the muscle
Yeah.
like it's like Play-Doh, or it doesn't work that way, right?
It mostly doesn't work. The best things you can do for shaping your muscles is you get bigger and you lose you get bigger muscles, you lose body fat. Like that's what you can do to shape your muscles. Now, I would say it's slightly disputed, but regardless of whether you think you absolutely can shape the muscles or you absolutely can't, practically speaking, it's probably not worth even focusing on when you're working out, right? So, like I said, you can make your muscles larger, you can make your muscles bigger, you can make your muscles more full. But it's hard to say that you can. Let's say if you have the best example is if you flex your biceps, right? Some people, if you look at them, like the top of the biceps gets really high, like the peak of a mountain. For some, it's very small, but it's more full from the shoulder to the elbow. So shaping that is incredibly hard and possibly impossible. Now you'll get some. Now one argument is right that let's say when the recruitment of muscles, right? If we, which lie throughout the entire muscle, that it recruits at a different, kind of slightly different rates throughout the muscle. So it might be slightly higher level of recruitment at the ends than it is at the center. And so theoretically, if it's recruiting at slightly different percentages in different areas of the muscle, then theoretically different parts of the muscle could be worked a little bit more. But I just think that even if you could prove that, and even if you could, prove that there is some kind of training effect, I think it would be so small that, again, it's not worth really, focusing on. Now, I think the one area where you can maybe, and again, it's even hard to explain, but is, let's say, an area like the chest. So the chest, we generally think of it as one muscle, but there are kind of three different heads. Like you have the kind of based on the three different, like you have the clavicular head, which is kind of the upper third or upper portion of the chest, not quite third, but upper portion of the chest. That you'll recruit slightly more in that area if you're doing something like an incline press. So it is possible, to slightly work, that area a little bit more. You have an area like maybe the hamstrings where you have two, separate heads, or even the biceps are the two heads. So there are people that will argue that if you do certain things at a certain speed or, in a certain way, that you might be able to kind of recruit slightly more in one portion. So there might be some credence to that. But again, I think for the average person, it's not going to matter so much. I think that might, maybe if you're a bodybuilder where every little detail counts, that's when you really might want to look into it more. But I think for the average person, or even somebody who's just looking to get bigger, you're better off just focused on varying your lifts and doing different things than you are in trying to specifically shape areas of the muscle. Because even if it is possible, I don't think we really know enough for anything to be more effective than just getting out there and lifting heavy.
All right. So speaking of heavy, now that's a very relative term.
Yeah.
And I've heard a lot of bodybuilders actually say, look, we're not strongmen. That's not what we do. We don't have to lift heavy.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of bodybuilders that sort of have built their physique off of what they say, not lifting heavy. They say it's more about the form and the repetitions and sort of that, the overall workout. So now when they say we're not lifting heavy, what do they mean by not lift? Like, what is heavy? Does heavy mean like as much as you can, like maxing out, or is heavy still heavy for the most people, and it's just relative to someone's strength?
So that's a great question, actually. So heavy is relative. I think you're right. I think for some, so generally when we talk about weightlifting, we reference the 1 rep max. So 1 rep max would be basically, what's the weight that you can perform one repetition with good form, anything beyond that, you can't do it. Either you can't do it with good form, you just can't get the weight up. So we tend to refer to strength training around percentages of 1 rep max. You have a few options of getting it. Either you do in one direction, you literally find your 1 rep max, and then you calculate kind of percentages. Now, there are ways to kind of calculate, how many reps you should do at 50%, how many reps you should do at 80%, 90%, etc. The other way to do it is to do, let's say, take an exercise and do 10 reps, and you kind of reverse engineer it. So you say, okay, if I can do 10 reps of this weight, then I'll probably be able to do 1 rep of another weight. So either way, there are ways of figuring out your 1 rep max. So so when it comes to lifting heavy, so the general idea is that, let's say we're in the, there are different ranges. So let's say you've got like your 1 to 3 rep max range. So let's say you're very extremely heavy range. And then you've got like a 3 to 6 rep max range. And that's like, very heavy. And then you've got your, let's say 6 to 8 or 6 to 9 rep max range. And that's where I would say that's, heavy. And then you've got your, 8 to 12 where it's kind of moderate weight, right? So there is a lot of research that's showing that basically it's not the amount of weight, so that you don't need to be in the extremely heavy or even the very heavy or even the heavy, repetition range to make strength gains. And I'll give you one study that kind of bears this out.
Wait, strength gains or size?
I'm sorry, size gains. Okay. Sorry, size gains. So you have 2 groups in this study, and one group lifted 50% of their 1 rep max. So they were in a 20 to 25 rep range. And then you had the second group. The second group was lifting at 90% of their 1 rep max. So that was about the 10 rep range. And so in the end, so both of these, they lifted to exhaustion. And that's going to be a key. When we get into this more, that's the key. So basically they found that they had similar strength gains. So
once again, strength or size?
I'm sorry. Similar gains in muscle fiber size.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for calling me out on that. So they both lifted, so exhaustion and fatigue are really the keys here. It's not so much about the amount of weight. It's about lifting to exhaustion. It's about getting to fatigue.
So
I think those are the most, that's the most important part of or if not the most, I'd say 1 and 1A with volume as far as like building size.
Okay, so a quick sidebar, just to touch on the strength concept. Do you know offhand whether it's the same thing for gaining lots of strength, or do you want to get closer to that?
Well,
max. And I know this is not the topic, but do you want to get closer to that 1 rep max if you are going for strength?
Okay, so strength is relative, right? So if I want to lift my 1 rep max, I got to focus on my 1 rep max.
Gotcha.
If I want to lift my 5 rep max, I got to focus on my 5 rep max. So strength is a little bit more straightforward. It's if I want to lift 500 pounds, I got to get as close to lifting 500 pounds as possible. There's no like, I can't do a muscle endurance. Let's say if I want to bench press 500, I can't do an endurance program where I do, let's say, 300 for 25 reps and then grab 500 and lift. Like I've got to work my way up towards 500. So I think, where strength gains, you can play with the weights and play with fatigue. With muscle size gains, I'm going to keep doing this today. With size gains, you can play with weights. With the strength gains, whatever the strength goal is, that's where you need to be focused on.
Okay, so you talked about volume and fatigue or exhaustion or whatever you want to call it. So there's actually a lot in there. So I have a few points to touch on. First is the tempo to which you're going to lift, to how you're going to get that volume, right? So if you're lifting fast, sometimes you can get out another rep or two. If you're lifting slow, it might not always work, but maybe you want to lift fast because of the form or the technique. And then the number of reps that you can do is sort of based on how much you rest, right? Like if you do an intense set and you rest for a couple minutes, you're going to be able to get up a couple more reps than if you rest for 30 seconds and then do another one. So what's the optimal approach for both? And I know, once again, if you have a specific goal in mind, like I want to just push up as many reps as fast as possible. If that's your weird goal, then that's what you're going to have to train for. Yeah. But for what we're talking about, which is size, which is mass, what is the consensus on the best tempo to lift, and also to maybe discuss the negative, which is when you're lowering the weight, as opposed to what? So what's the opposite of the negative?
The positive.
Is that what it's called? That's not what it's called, though.
Yeah, no, there's the concentric portion. So that's the part where let's say if I'm doing a bicep curl, where I'm lifting the barbell up or kind of shortening the muscle that I'm working. And then there's the eccentric, where you're controlling the barbell back down, or yes, I am, but or where you're lowering or lengthening the muscle. So there's no consensus really. There are different rules of thumb. You're gonna hear different ideas
on how fast,
on how what your tempo is. So the rule of thumb is typically.
Well, you explain what tempo is first. I know I sort of
exactly.
spouted that term out. I sort of spouted that term out, but let's.
The tempo is just the pace, the speed you lift. It's so okay. Any lift has really kind of four parts. There are two isometric contractions, which is static, right, where you're not moving. There's a concentric and there's an eccentric portion. So again, generally the concentric portion is going to be shortening of the muscle. So whatever the muscle is, you're shortening. If it's with weights, it's always going to be against gravity. Right? Whatever you're doing, you're working against gravity. But again, that's not quite true, because different muscles are lengthening and shortening when we do it. So let's say the concentric, to make things simple, is the hard part, right? There's a part where you're exerting force against an object. The eccentric part is you're controlling it back. So you're controlling the object back. That's usually the kind of easier part, because you don't have to be at full strength to control the weight down. And then you have two isometric portions, right? There's one at the top and one at the bottom. So if I start a bicep curl, right, I start with my arms fully extended. That's isometric. When I curl, that's concentric. I pause at the top. That's another isometric, and then I control it back down. That's eccentric. So there's four parts. So the general rule of thumb, and again, I wouldn't even say this is a general rule of thumb. This is just kind of around what I would work with is you do 1 second concentric, but that changes as the exercise gets heavier. So it may, if you're doing a heavy bicep curl or heavy bench press, it may take you more than 1 second for the concentric. But generally, kind of 1 to 2 seconds. Let's say concentric. You do about a 1 second pause. And then you do about 3 second eccentric. So 3 seconds controlling, the weight down. So again, that's kind of a rough idea, but there's a lot of research showing that you can get strength gains both by doing.
Said it again.
God damn. You can get size gains by doing. We should do a shot. We should do shots. Like I'll take a shot of tequila. If I didn't have to work, we could do that. We should do a drunk episode one day.
Okay.
That would be hilarious. Yeah, that would be funny.
Well, especially hilarious to see Ryan, Ryan getting drunk.
Yeah, that would be fun. Maybe we'll do that one day. Anyway, back to this explanation. So you can get strength or size gains doing very slow eccentric contractions, or what we call negative, training. But you can also get strength gains doing like what I mentioned, and you can also do strength gains doing explosive contractions. And there's actually a study that was testing, the difference between doing normal contractions, explosive, and just very slow contractions. And so in this study, they had 43 untrained males. So, you always have to kind of look at, who are you dealing with? Who are you studying? What does the study really tell you? So, we'll take what we can take out of this. But you got 43 untrained males in their 20s. They did 40 contractions 3 times a week for 3 months on the quads. So it's very, very, very narrow range we're working with. But one group did just normal contractions with the quadriceps. I think it was a leg extension. The other one did explosive contractions. And the other one did very controlled, slower contractions. And the explosive contractions gained the most size of the group. So again, we're dealing with, untrained males in their 20s, so who knows? But there is something to be said for kind of any style of tempo. So no one tempo necessarily beats all. I'll tell you my own personal anecdote is when we were younger lifting heavy weights, like I could squat 500 pounds. I could deadlift 500 pounds, not super heavy, but certainly fairly heavy. But my legs were never that big. My legs weren't tiny, but my legs weren't all that big. And then over the last few years, all I do are, I do a lot of jumps, I do a lot of sprints, I do a lot of kicks, I do a lot of burpees, but I don't lift heavy at all. I don't lift any weights really. And my legs are significantly bigger than they were when I was lifting heavy weights. But I do lots of explosive contractions, whether it's the jumping or whether it's the sprinting or whether it's the kicking. So, again, you don't ever want to use my own personal kind of experience is not, science and you shouldn't judge the rest of it by that. But, in my own experience, it bears out what some of the research says, which is that you can still gain size on the legs, even with more explosive, powerful contractions without as much weight.
Well, let's not forget the fact that you built up the muscle,
sure,
and the strength of it, and
sure,
some of the size doing lifting for
sure,
years before.
Yeah.
So who knows if you would see the same type of gains?
Probably not. I would definitely argue probably not. But it's also strange that while I was doing all the heavy lifting, that my legs didn't adapt by growing. But once I started doing a lot of the really explosive contractions with the quads, it did. Now, so your second question you had was rest. So
because that's directly related to
absolutely.
volume. You say volume is very important, but how much you're resting. And also resting between sets, and then very also important, as you mentioned, is sort of resting in general. Days of rest, sleeping rest. I know you don't want to touch on that, but that's going to factor in.
So I mean, look, listen to Chris Winter, that interview. If you want to know how much to sleep, listen to that. I think that's enough to kind of give you as far as what you need sleeping. I think we can agree that if you're not getting an appropriate sleep, it's going to affect you. So we'll leave it at that. That was a great episode, so you should listen if you haven't. But as far as, between sets, the general rule of thumb is actually between 1 to 5 minutes. And really, a lot of it depends on the weight. If you're doing very, very heavy weights, you're going to be on the longer end of that, so you'll be closer to 5 minutes. If you're doing lighter weights, you can probably get away with the 1 minute, but there definitely is a lot of research now that's showing that the longer rest may be more helpful. And I'll give you another example of a study. 16 males, and they did different different rest periods, right? One group did a 1 minute rest period, the other group did a 5 minute rest period. Now, they did muscle biopsies immediately, 4 hours, 24 hours, and 48 hours later. And they were analyzing the myofibrillar protein synthesis. And what they found was that the group that had the longer rest actually had a twofold increase in myofibrillar protein synthesis, which is going to directly correlate to the gains in size. So, again, generally you're looking at 2 to 3 minutes rest with in between sets when you're lifting heavier or on the heavier side. But again, if you're lifting really, really heavy, in that 1 to 3 rep range, even in that 3 to 6 rep range, I would definitely suggest maybe, you getting closer to 4 or 5 minute rest in between sets to get full recovery.
So it would imply that longer workouts are going to be better at helping someone gain size. Now, I know that might seem like a bit of an obvious question, but let's put it against another point, such as if you could only get to the gym 3 days a week, but you can do really long workouts and get a lot of volume in each in the individual workouts, is that going to be more effective than, say, going to the gym 5 days a week but doing less in those workouts, or is it the same?
That's going to depend a little bit on the person. So everybody reacts different. So you're going to have some people who can get away with 3 days a week of lifting. And you're going to have some people who need to spend 6 days in the gym. So I think in general, volume is one of the keys, and has generally been thought to be one of the keys to building size. So you're going to have to spend a lot of time in the gym. I think it just, everybody's going to be a little bit different. Like when I lifted weights, I didn't need to spend as much time in the gym as some other people who needed to spend a lot more. And there are people who need to spend less time than I do. So it does vary quite a bit. Person to person.
Well, also, what I was asking was, does the amount of time, not the overall time at the gym, but the volume in one sitting, does that matter?
Yeah.
Right. So, like 2 hours, 3 days a week, is that better than 1 hour, 5 days a week, or 6 days a week? Because that's the exact same. That's 6 hours either way. Does it, or is it just depending on the person?
Depends on the person.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit more on the person. Really, and the goal and where they are in their own personal kind of thing. I would say that if you're on the higher levels, you're probably going to need to spend more time, fewer days, heavier, on those days. But again, everyone's a little bit different. So where someone's starting off, probably can get away with a few days a week lifting heavy. But as you increase in your own size, I think there more overall time needs to be spent, working out. The kind of quality. Again, I don't want to say that completely because the volume is important, but the quality of the workouts, also takes over, the kind of quantity of workouts.
All right, so touch on the importance of rest. I know you said sleep, but not necessarily sleep, but just rest, meaning is there diminishing returns if you're working out without a rest day? Why is that rest day important?
Yeah. Well, okay, so again, the general rule of thumb is you give each muscle group 24 to 48 hours to recover, right? So like we talked about earlier, the kind of prevailing theory is you're doing damage to the muscles. So if you damage something, you need it to repair. And so if I go and do heavy chest one day and I go back and do heavy chest the next day, diminishing returns there. So you do need to give it a little bit of rest. Now, again, it's one of those things where everyone's a little bit different, and per muscle group, some people can get away, working groups once a week and putting on size, where others need to do 2 or 3 times a week. So if you find that you're building everywhere but your arms are lacking, you might need to spend more time on your arms. If your triceps are lacking, you may need to spend more time on your triceps. If the chest is growing more rapidly than everything else, maybe you need to kind of cut back from 2 days a week to 1 day a week. So you definitely don't want to do back-to-back days of heavy strength training, and you might not even want to do like alternate, like a Monday, Wednesday. But, again, everyone's a little bit different. And, so you kind of have to feel for, how does your body respond to the training? And again, some people can get away with 1, some can get away with 2, some need 3. It really depends. And everywhere is a little bit different. And muscle groups are a little bit different, but we'll get into some of these things. Kind of don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but we'll get into some of these things later. All
right. So you had mentioned earlier that if you go for weeks without working out, your muscles will get a little bit smaller, and maybe you won't be able to lift as much right off the bat, but you'll gain it back pretty quickly, and you'll be able to just get back to your level of strength. How much of that is the strength of the muscle, and how much of that is your muscle memory, your ability to perform a task that you've performed? And also just in general, what is the role of muscle memory, right? You saw people that were relatively small doing these heavy bench presses, and we're like wondering, and then you're like, we realized that they were always bench pressing. Yeah. So how much of it is just that they got good at that motion?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. That part of the whole process is the brain and the body working. So it's kind of the neuromuscular system figuring out these patterns and moves. So that's why when people start off, you'll notice if you've ever all of us have been through this, where we went from a period where we never worked out or never worked out in earnest, and we started lifting weights, and pretty rapidly you make gains in the weights you can lift. And I also want to make it clear it's a little bit different from getting stronger, because that initial reaction or adaptation is really the brain and the body figuring out, okay, here's the sequence that I need to fire my muscles in order to lift this weight. And once your brain and body kind of figure that out, then you can really start to lift the weight. So that's where initially, like for somebody, bench pressing 20 pounds might be really hard, but then the next week you're bench pressing 70 pounds. And it's like, well, what just happened? I didn't increase more than 3 times my strength. It's just that you kind of figured out the patterns. It's the same thing you do with any, if you're learning a new movement or a dance move or a martial arts move or a sports move, that that first few times you do it, it can be really, really hard. And then even a week later, you figure it out because the brain and the body are just kind of figuring out the movement. So you've got that part. That's part 1. When you gain the strength. So now you've got your strength. Now, even if you stop working out, the muscle does kind of possess not only memories of the kind of movement patterns, but it also possesses memories of earlier growth. And so, again, lots of research kind of into this field, and it's showing that, kind of changes, there are changes into the DNA as the muscles grow. And so this allows, the muscles to grow after, periods of not use using them. And there are some implications here, especially when it comes to athletes, when it comes to, dealing with injuries and dealing with drugs. So, on the positive side, if you're an athlete and you suffer a major, even a catastrophic injury, and you're out for an extended period of time, the muscle memory is there enough that, depending on how well you can recover from the actual injury, you can retain, pretty close to your earlier performance. Again, a lot of it depends on how bad the injury was. So let's say I'm a sprinter or whatever, and I break my arm and I can't run, I can't sprint because of the broken arm. Even if you're not running, the muscles retain the memory, so you can come back, to your full strength. Now, if I'm a sprinter and I shatter my knee, probably not going to return back to full strength, but that has more to do with the condition of the knee after healing than it does to do with the actual muscles. But on the negative side, you're also dealing with drugs. So, if you do performance enhancing drugs and you build muscles from that, even when you stop using it, those strength gains are still there. Even if you stop lifting, those strength gains are still there. And, again, another study, now this was with mice, but they did show long-term benefits of steroid use. So basically what they did is they gave the mice a dose of this, steroids, and then it went through 3 months of withdrawal. And they were able to increase, basically from going, so they basically, they had built their strength, then stopped doing the steroids. And after 3 months, they went back to doing kind of load-bearing exercise. And I'm forgetting what the load-bearing exercise is. Probably something to do with the wheel or something. Who knows? Whatever it was. Compared to other mice, they were able to increase 30% of their strength right away following the load-bearing exercise. So, and there are other studies. So, we're dealing with a situation where, and this is, again, a topic for a different podcast, but basically, should the penalties for performance-enhancing drug use be, more steep than they are now? Because, those who do use them, the benefits will far outlast the, 3-month or 6-month or even year suspension that they get for getting caught.
That is... Yeah, well, there's a lot.
No, there's
That's
lots
Pandora's box.
Yeah. So,
right.
so we'll stay away from that for now. But just to say that muscle memory is there. So if you lift a lot, you lift heavy, you get stronger, something happens where you stop. You're not starting from scratch when you come back. Like, it's there. It may feel like you are, but you regain, your I don't know that you'll regain your previous strength. It'll take work to get back there, but you don't start from zero again. You gain that back pretty quickly.
So someone might say, well, I got the biggest size gains within this, when I, between year, 6 months in a year when I first started lifting. That's when I saw a lot of size gains. There maybe between the first and second year. But now my muscles, their memory, they know the routine too well. And I could change it up. But what if I start doing completely new things? Like, there's a term called muscle confusion. Yeah. It sort of became a buzzword. Is there any benefit to just doing something weird and different every time and thinking that because your muscles doesn't know what it's doing, you're going to gain more size?
There's some credence to that, and there's some minimal research from what I could find. I couldn't find a lot. But there does seem to be like research showing that kind of varying your movements is beneficial. Now the question is how often, and I think there's no real consensus. I personally, like, there are some people who will say, like, do one set of a bench press and then go right away and do a set of fly, like almost you do one set of thing at a time. You could try that. I think there's so many things to try that you can. I would say the more important thing is to vary the exercises, like, week to week and month to month. But, the other issue is, in order to gain strength, you do need to work on some of the same movements. So, I don't think that you should be trying wildly different moves every time you work out, because if you want to gain size and strength, you do need, if you want to gain strength, you need to focus on the same moves. And if you want to gain size, you do need to that volume of work. So I think there are different schools of thought on this, and it's totally worth trying something. So if you're bored with your workout and you want to try something new, it's perfectly fine. But I do think, variation is important, but, complete chaos, I would probably stay away from it, at least for anyone that's starting.
Okay. All right. So shifting gears, and I'm sure you've gotten a ton of questions about this over the years. I know I've had discussions about it, but what is really the difference between how men and women should train? Like genetically, what's different? Like I know we've talked about it before, but just briefly sort of touch on it and sort of discuss that concept where a woman will say, well, I don't want to get big like a guy. Or some women want to be bodybuilders, but most will say, look, I don't want to be big. That's why I do these light weights where you see a woman doing 30 easy reps, thinking that she might be, improving her muscles. So just discuss a little bit about that.
All right. So a couple of things to talk about here. Again, this is a whole subject we could spend a whole podcast on. But basically, from a practical standpoint, men and women, the training is going to be the same. So how I train a woman for strength and how I train a man is going to be the same if the goals are the same. So generally speaking, you're not going to be changing too much about how you're approaching the training if the goals are the same. That being said, there are differences, right? So there are hormone differences that are going to have a different effect, kind of regarding the result. In addition to that, on average, men have about 1/3 more muscle than women. Additionally, the types of muscles they have are different. So men have more, not that they're different, but they have more of. So you have kind of type 1 and type 2. We'll just leave it at that for now. It can get a little more complicated. But this, for simple purposes, type 1 is kind of slower, more endurance muscles. So somebody who's a really slow twitch. So somebody who's a really good high level endurance runners are going to typically have more predominantly or a high percentage of type 1 muscle fibers, because those aren't super powerful, but are great for endurance. Then you have type 2, and then type 2 and type 2A that are more powerful. So they're not as long lasting. So they're great for. So you'll find people in explosive sports and powerful people, and large, it's often with larger size, are going to have more predominantly type 2. And so men have more type 2, so they have greater growth potential. So now men have on average more muscle. The muscles that they do have more growth potential. And then, when it comes to the sex hormone, so men have more testosterone, and testosterone kind of combined with the weightlifting is really what's going to help you build muscle. So, all that's being said to say that basically men generally have an easier time building muscle. It's not to say women can't build muscle. That's not to say that you don't have women that will be, bigger than the average man, but in general, it's going to be easier for men to gain size. So the, kind of effort that you put in as a woman, especially if you want to gain size, is generally going to be harder, to get equal or similar gains to a man. But like what I said, all that being said, kind of functionally things are the same. So the way we're gonna train is the same. So when you compare kind of performance and sports, you'll find that kind of men obviously are going to be with more muscle, going to be better at more powerful sports. Women, kind of comparatively, are slightly better at endurance sports. Now, if you look at performance, like if you look at a marathon, because someone will say, "Oh, well, how are women better than men at endurance sports?" Because men have men have better times in a marathon. And if you kind of look at it, it's all kind of, a lot of that can be explained away by still the differences in kind of body composition. And if you look at men and women with similar body composition, so body composition basically is your fat to lean weight composition, and generally fat mass to lean muscle mass. Men and women at similar weights perform similarly. So if you take a man and a woman that are both 140 pounds and are at 12 or 13% body fat, their performance in a variety of ways is going to be very, very similar. So you see, like the men's kind of difference in performance has a lot to do with the ability, that kind of greater growth potential for size and strength, if that makes sense.
And let's not forget the fact that with and I know this is more about strength than about size, but there are very, very small women that weigh under 100 pounds that, not in absolute strength, but pound for pound, are going to be stronger than big time power lifters, right? I'm talking about Olympic weightlifters.
Yeah,
so
sure.
They're now not necessarily in absolute strength, but proportionally. Right, and I guess that's tough to say because the smaller people in general can be proportionally stronger.
Yeah,
but not necessarily stronger in absolute strength. So I guess that has more to do with just the size thing. In general, if someone weighs 300 pounds, they're going to be able to push more, but maybe not as much proportionally. So a woman who weighs 100 pounds, it's not uncommon that they could lift that they could pick up 300 pounds over their head, right, with the proper technique and proper lift, right? But it's not, you might not see someone who weighs, 300 pounds being able to lift 1,000 pounds over their head. So am I sort of in the right vicinity? Now it's more of a strength thing, and a lot of technique and Olympic lifts. So.
I guess, yeah, I'm not sure.
I went off on a tangent there.
Cool.
All right.
Point being, people who are very much smaller can have a good deal of strength, and proportionally can have big,
which goes
greater
against the
strength,
whole size concept.
Yeah,
but
again,
whatever.
yeah.
Let's okay. We'll leave it at that because
cool. Yeah.
All right. So I guess another question that often comes up is age and how that affects someone's size, whether it's do you lose size, and for men and women, right? Do you lose size when you get older? Is it more difficult to gain size as you get when you're older? Is it easier to gain size when you're 18 years old as compared to when you're 50, right? Can you gain size when you're slightly older?
To answer to all those questions is yes. Next question. No, okay. All right. So age is a big issue. So there's what's called sarcopenia, which is the basically gradual loss of muscle mass, which happens with age. So you have this kind of natural atrophy. Once we hit 30, which we're well past that right now, you naturally lose muscle mass. And then, as we age, it's harder to produce the kind of myonuclei. Myonuclei is simple. It's just the nucleus of the muscle fiber. And we need that to increase our size. So we produce less as we age, and so it becomes much harder. You also have fewer motor neurons, and the motor neurons are again needed to build muscle size. So as we age, fewer myonuclei, fewer motor neurons. We increase insulin resistance. We decrease estrogen. We decrease testosterone. So all of these together, natural occurring things, equal less muscle mass when you're older. That's the bad news. The good news is that resistance training can largely offset this, and that studies show that exercising at a younger age helps significantly. So these are both beneficial to us, right? We've started exercising when we were 16, and as long as you're consistent, you can mostly maintain what you have. Now, it'll become harder, and there are all kinds of other things when it comes to recovery and injuries and health and just life in general that may get in the way. But for the most part, if you started young and if you continue to lift and you're able to avoid some of the pitfalls just that come with life, you can avoid significant loss. Now, if you have somebody who doesn't exercise at all, that's where it becomes a huge problem, because if you don't exercise at all, you don't do any resistance training, it's very likely that atrophy is very likely, and then that becomes problematic. You're dealing with osteoporosis, you're dealing with a lot of other issues that will kind of compound on that, if you're not exercising. So that's where exercise as you get older is really important. Even if you don't do it, it's never too late to begin. And so, like I said, you can offset those changes by beginning some kind of a training program. I have a couple other points to make there, but do you have any questions first?
So for men,
yeah,
I know this is related to size because clearly testosterone helps with building size or even maintaining size. I've heard that lifting weights actually helps to increase testosterone or helps stabilize testosterone. Do you know any of the science of that?
Let's.
I'm just. Look, I know that you're not a scientist, you're not a biologist, but I'm just curious. Have you heard that?
You mean over you're not like while you're exercising, or just overall that you're gonna increase?
Or while.
Yeah, I mean, so you'll hear that in bodybuilding a lot, that people kind of, when they're training to target kind of the natural growth hormone and testosterone. And so I think the research shows that while you're exercising, the kind of naturally occurring levels of testosterone and of growth hormone actually don't seem to be affected. So it shows kind of almost identical production among men and women. So there doesn't seem to be the actual increase in the hormones doesn't seem to change. It's just that the kind of training effect, like the new muscle protein, seems to be different among men and women. So kind of like the effect is the result is different, but it doesn't seem to be that naturally occurring testosterone. Now I think yes, not I just want to say this 100%, but you can increase the testosterone levels, and you can start overall, and you decrease. You can kind of slow down the natural decrease, I believe, but that's something I don't want to say 100% sure because I'm not 100%.
That'll be a good episode.
Yeah, we can talk about that later. So I just want to say I think.
Because I've heard that
but
it increases that lifting weights will increase testosterone.
Yeah, we're gonna hear that all the time. So yes, overall. But I don't. Yeah, so like in the moment, I don't think so. Overall, I do, but I don't want to say that for sure because I'm just not that's just something I'm not 100% on. So now, another thing that is important for aging and maintaining muscle size. So protein intake. Again, a little slightly into diet, which is Tony's not here, but hopefully she will agree with what I have to say. And if she doesn't, then she can call me out and give us the right information. But a couple things that you can do diet wise when it comes to building and or maintaining size when you get older is, again, protein intake will help. Vitamin D. So whether it's through sunlight, ideally, or through supplementation, that's going to be important. And then also dietary acid balance is important. So you have acidic foods like meats and grains. And so if you have if you're high in acidic foods and you're low in alkalizing foods like fruits, vegetables, then if that balance is off, it can also be bad for muscle growth or maintaining muscle mass as you get older. So finding the right dietary acid balance, and that's something that Tony can probably speak to a little bit better. I've read a couple articles on it, but that's something we could talk to her about where she can explain it better. But those seem to be the things nutrition-wise that you can do as you're getting older. And then I have just one other point for women, so obviously estrogen, women have higher estrogen levels, and estrogen acts as a regulator of muscle cell metabolism in both men and women. So as for both men and women, as you get older, estrogen decreases, and especially with women with menopause, there is potential for kind of deterioration in the muscle. Especially for women, as you reach that point. So I think in either case, if you're men and women, exercise is key, but there also may be a situation where medical intervention is important. If you're finding atrophy or just being too lethargic or too tired, there are tons of not tons, but there are interventions that are available medically if you find that you're older and you're just struggling to maintain or build muscle mass.
That was what I was going to ask next. Now I know that it's actually very, very common for women that are either premenopausal or going through menopause or have gone through it to take estrogen and will continue to take estrogen for the rest of their lives. Some women will just do that. I know that there's a lot of there's sort of some debate with the testosterone for men, whether they're taking supplement or growth hormone is a game changer or whether it has some effects, and which would actually also be, we wanted to do an episode on taking hormones as a supplement. With what you know right now, what does the science or the research say on taking testosterone as a supplement? Or is growth hormone testosterone, is that the same thing?
Yeah, no, but when you're dealing with growth hormone and or testosterone, those are things that obviously they're big in the bodybuilding and the sports areas. And they're big among
health.
They're big amongst the general population as well. I would say from what I understand, knowing people who have gone through kind of testosterone replacement therapy and done various things, I'm pretty sure they can be effective. I think we don't have enough to know what quite are the effects and what the dosage and everything. So I would just say it's a medical intervention. So anytime you're dealing with any of that, those are medical issues that need to be dealt with a professional. So I don't want to give my advice on it because I think personally. Now as a vain guy, sure, if I find that I'm just having a hard time keeping up, I might consider going to some, weird, not so, sketchy doctor, because I'm vain and I want to, have big muscles. But, you'd want to go to somebody who's an expert and ideally it should be a real problem. It shouldn't just be, my biceps aren't as big as that 25-year-old. Like probably not going to be as big as the 25-year-old. But if you find that, I'm tired, out of energy, I'm lethargic, you may need to get your testosterone checked. You may need to see, you may need therapy. So, I'd say it can be effective, but you definitely don't want to kind of administer, and you don't want to go to Joey at the gym. You want to go to a professional, go to a doctor who has experience in this and who you can trust.
So it's sort of the way you were saying it earlier about steroids, performance enhancing drugs. Yes, for someone who is a professional, you're not allowed to do it, right? I mean, you could cheat on a lot of it, and it's still as much of all you sport fans around the world want to think that it's not in your sport. It is. It's in every sport for the most part, right? And it's being done, and they're getting better at masking it. And as when they figure out one test, there's a new drug that comes out, there's a new masking agent. It's very widespread. That's my opinion, right? I think it is. And if you ask a lot of athletes, they had an interview with Christy Martin, the boxer who had a long career, and she discussed how she was doing it and how so many people in boxing, and you think that boxing is sort of, even though now Canelo was hit twice for it and blamed it on meat contamination or something like that. I personally believe that it's very widespread. No matter what the tests are, people are going to figure out ways around it. People are always going to cheat the system if they can. So I don't know what your opinion's on that. If you think they're super widespread, I think they are all over in every sport, basically. Yeah. Like you would think in cycling, why would you need it? But it's very prevalent in cycling, and that's another issue, right? So you're an athlete, you're really not allowed to do it. But so really, what's to stop someone from saying, I know I'm going to get big muscles. I'm going to keep some of my strength gains. I'm going to keep some of my size gains. What's the harm in just taking some steroids for a little bit, right? It's my body, who cares? I can do it. I'm just not going to take a lot. Like, really, what's the harm in taking a little bit and saying, look, I'll just do it to get, my strength and my size up, right? Really, honestly.
I think you asked like 30 questions in that rant.
Well, we don't have to talk too much about the sport asking, but
it was just funny that you kept asking questions, and I'm like, all right, well, here's my, and then you just keep going, and then you ask another question, and then you just keep, don't delete it, and then you keep going. So it's just funny. No, I mostly agree. I think if it's for sport, it sucks because it's not an even playing field, and not everyone's doing it. And again, as we talked about, there seem to be some actual genetic, changes. So it's not fair, and it's cheating, and especially in combat sports is even worse because you're in a sport that you can kill somebody. So I think it's wrong morally. In everyday life, sure, why not? It doesn't matter. I just think we don't quite know all the effects.
Now you're gonna tell our listeners that it's okay for them to take anabolic steroids.
It's a good thing we're not famous yet, right? Because then the headline would be like, Ryan George says, take anabolic steroids. No,
my personal opinion is that if someone to do what they want with their body, like I think that they should.
My super libertarian stepson would cringe at me saying, but I'm as socially libertarian, like for the most part, like you can do whatever the hell you want, right? I mean, we get into other areas of the world, but like,
why would he? Why would you?
Because he's like libertarian on everything. He believes there should be no government. Like zero government, or he believes,
would be in favor whatever.
micro
If you want to
economies.
take,
Yeah, you can do it,
if
yeah.
you want to take as much steroid, as many steroids as you want, go for it.
So I just thought it'd be funny if he listens to this, like, because he'd say, you're just because you're libertarian on social things doesn't mean that. But that's a whole
I see
other
what you're saying.
side.
Okay.
Regardless, no, I mean, look, you do whatever you want, as long as, but being in context is key. So as long as it doesn't affect other people, if if it's a sport and there's an even playing field and everyone can do it, fine. But that, they're all. I mean, you can dive down the moral rabbit hole, because then we could talk about, well, what about kids who don't have access to high level trainers and coaches and nutrition and this and that and the other. So you're never going to have a completely even playing field. But I do think that performance enhancing drugs are just have this kind of pernicious effect on sports, and it sucks. But then that kind of the negative connotation we have with drugs gets applied to real life, and then you get the egos too. Like, you're gonna get the guys that's like, even us, like when you'd see the really big guys that you're like, oh well, screw them, they're just on steroids. Like, look, who cares? You can do what you want. I think you want to be aware and cognizant of the health effects. So I'm not saying everybody just do anabolic steroids. I say, if you want to do it. Be aware that there may be some, negative outcomes, and that's that. I mean, there's a reason why bodybuilders are dropping dead at young ages, and it's probably more due to abuse. I think that, more likely than not, people who are doing a little bit of TRT, kind of therapy to help, it's probably not going to kill them, but we don't know. So I think, as always, it's kind of use at your own risk. Right, so I think we're going along. So we could spend a month talking about this, but we'll probably find an expert anyway to talk about it. So let's get to the next.
So, I think we're almost, we're coming to the end here.
Yeah,
I know there's a
couple more things.
There's a few more things to discuss.
Yeah.
Right. So for me, certain parts of my body blow up. Like, I have a huge back. Right, I got big shoulders, but for some reason my biceps can't really they just don't get bigger. Is that just because? And I put in decent volume. I know that I haven't put in tons of volume.
Yeah.
So why is it that for some people, some parts of their body will grow? Is that genetics too? Like, some parts will just blow up, and some parts you can't seem to get it bigger.
No, that's genetics. Some people just have harder areas than others. Now the couple things to think of. One thing I think about is, again, we talked about like kind of muscle fiber distribution. And so, it's like, and this is more personal, like what I noticed, but you see a lot of times athletes, you notice they have big calves, big forearms, and big traps, which means they probably have, more type 2 fibers in the calves, the forearms, and traps. And you get some guys who just don't have that. So, if you want bigger calves and they just can't grow, it's going to be kind of tough. If you want certain areas, like if you just want much bigger in that area, you're going to have to really work at it. And it just means just extra work. It's just genetics. Your body's kind of built the way it's built. And if you have an area that's not growing as much as the others, like I remember there's a guy who was like, you see a lot massive up top, and they have tiny little calves, and it's not that. And we will joke that they keep skipping leg day, but a lot of times no, it's just for whatever reason they just have fewer of the type 2 fibers in those calves, and they just got to lift heavier, or they just have to work harder.
So, our buddy growing up, who was very big as a teenager, in his early 20s, and then sort of stopped lifting weights, would tell me in regards to you as why Ryan looks so good. When you look at me, like, Ryan's a little bigger than me. I don't know if full mass. I think I'm probably heavier than you, right? But if you look at Ryan and I side by side, right, his muscles aren't that much bigger than mine. They're a bit, but they look a lot bigger than mine, right? They just look more. They are, and Ryan has, put the fact that he has less fat on him, right? So that also, right, I have more fat on me, but he would say, well, Ryan has these that you have very big joints. You have these sort of long limbs. Ryan has these tiny muscle bellies. Yeah. And that's why in certain bodybuilders that have tiny joints, large muscle bellies and tiny joints will make you look bigger. And that's why why bodybuilders that have certain that aren't too tall but aren't too short either, right, and have these tiny joints and these large muscle bellies look bigger.
Yeah, no, I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, but that's a visual thing. Like, if you're shorter but bigger, you're going to look, proportionally larger than somebody who's really tall, maybe the same size. Larger muscle bellies, that's going to make a difference. Certain ways things are shaped, like naturally, like I have larger shoulders, so the larger shoulders kind of create what looks like a deeper kind of line at the biceps. So I think there are certain things that will look bigger, and kind of the way you're shaped is gonna make a little bit difference. Unfortunately, you just can't really,
You remember that time
shape.
when we were 17 years old, and we just had eaten dinner somewhere, and we were both wearing sleeveless shirts, like thinking we're all big and whatnot. And then we met our friend at the Night of Champions.
Yeah, it's like a bodybuilding competition, and I never felt so small in my life.
It was just like, oh.
Yeah, that was pretty awful. It hurts you.
Humbling very quickly.
When you're like an 18-year-old kid and you realize, there are people way, 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 way bigger than me.
So, that's funny. Now, you talked a little bit about diet, and we know the very basics of that we'll get into is if you want to gain size, you have to increase your caloric intake, right? So you have to eat more. Now that doesn't mean we know Tony would say that doesn't mean eat crap, right? You still want to eat healthy foods, but you're gonna have to increase your caloric intake. So now, what about supplements? I know we recently did an episode on supplements losing weight or helping you lose weight, or whether that's actually true. But can weight gainers and protein, what's your opinion? What does the science say on taking supplements to help gain size?
So Tony can speak to this more than I can. Clearly, okay, we've kind of ad nauseum talked about calories in versus calories out. That mostly is true. If you want to get bigger, then you've got to eat more. So whatever you expend, you need to increase your calories by a good deal. 300 to 500 calories or more per day. So now the supplements can be helpful. I think the ones that and I'll only speak about the ones that I know have a good deal of science. So you have kind of branched chain amino acids. Those are, I guess, from what the research shows, somewhat helpful. In that they kind of stimulate a little bit greater response post-exercise, but it's only slightly greater than than a placebo in most studies. What the reason why, or kind of the theory why, is that they kind of lack the essential amino acids. So what studies have found is that if you combine whey protein, which has the essential amino acids, with branched chain amino acids, that seems to be effective in kind of increasing kind of the muscle response post-exercise. And then you have creatine, which we used when we were little, but creatine works. Lots of studies probably the most studied supplement. It's not not gonna replace working hard, but it definitely allows for kind of more continued muscle exertion and greater usage of load. I think one thing that does happen is it tends to taper off fairly quickly. So you do want to you can do your own research on kind of the cycles to use it and how often to use it and everything. But beyond kind of making sure, again, this is a dietary thing, but protein intake should be fairly high. Or higher protein intake seems to produce a better response. And then again, whey protein with branched chain amino acids, creatine, those seem to work. All the other stuff, I would say it's not worth it unless you're getting to the level of performance enhancing drugs. You're kind of good with if you have a good diet and you supplement with some extra protein and amino acids. Again, some creatine should be fine.
All right, so here's sort of the question everyone wants to know, and it's something that would be wonderful if it could happen. And I actually heard that it might be possible. Mm-hmm. Can you gain size in terms of muscle while losing fat?
That's There was an article, so I'm gonna take a quote from the article, which is that's like the holy grail of exercise, which it is, right? And now people sometimes, I think most of these ideas are gone. We don't see them, or hear it much. But like kind of that you can replace muscle with fat, or that you can melt the muscle away or turn muscle into fat, or fat into muscle. We don't hear that as much anymore. But there is a question of, can we lose fat while we're also building muscle at the same time? And so kind of the short answer is, probably. It's very hard, but it's at least possible in some populations. So, I'll give you an example of a study. So the study basically took overweight young men. They had two groups. So one group did, hard exercise, and they were restricted calories. So I think they were kind of 40%, but they had high protein. And the other group, everything was the same, but their protein intake was normal, kind of normal protein intake. And what they actually found was that both groups lost weight, but the group that had the higher protein intake lost or maintained their muscle mass. So they didn't actually lose muscle; they just lost fat. So one other thing to add is that in both groups, it was hard, intense exercise. So basically, and again, this is overweight young men. So it's maybe we need to see how this works with, fit or elite athletes, et cetera, et cetera. But, basically, if you want to try to build muscle and lose fat at the same time, it's going to be done with, very hard exercise, calorie restriction, high protein, and it's possible to get done with certain populations, but I think it's one of those things that we need more research. But at least there's hope that maybe we'll find the Holy Grail.
And even if that Holy Grail doesn't completely exist, if you gain a lot of muscle, we know that it increases your metabolism. So maybe you won't be losing fat while you're gaining it, but certainly it may make it easier to lose it when you choose to go for a cut phase. When you try to lose fat, would you say that is somewhat accurate?
Probably.
Right, just because will have a higher metabolism. Now, no, we know that you may lose some muscle in the process as well, but having more muscle probably will not hurt you when it comes to wanting to lose fat.
Probably not.
Wow. So, do you think that this is our longest podcast we've ever done?
Yeah, I thought the Chris Winter episode was our longest, but I'm interested. This might be the longest episode we've ever done, especially with just the two of us.
Yeah. All right. Well, since we covered so much, we'll just sum up some of the ideas.
All right. Well, I'm going to sum up, but I'm also adding there are going to be a couple things we maybe talked about or touched on or barely touched on. But, basically, one thing I'd like
maybe we need to do a part 2.
No, we don't need. I don't think we need a part 2. Well, but if you were one of the people that asked us for this episode, if you think we need a part 2, let me know. But basically, I gave a lot of information. But for the average person, they just kind of want to know, okay, well, what are the principles? What do I need to focus on? So, I'll just try to give you a list of like 8 things or whatever, that you really want to focus on when you're lifting. So, one is progressive overload. So what that means basically is that, over time, you need to increase the stress, in order to make progress. So basically if I bench press 100 pounds this week, and I stay at 100 pounds, the body has no need to adapt because I'm adapted to lifting 100 pounds. So, next week I got to do 105 pounds or 110 pounds. So you have to kind of progressive over time, increase the amount of stress so that's constantly creating this kind of a cycle of adaptation where the body has to react. Now, there are plateaus, and so that's why changing up exercises, trying different things is always an important aspect and something that should be done so that you're never stuck on, if you're stuck with the same 5 exercises, at some point you reach your level where, I just can't do it. And so by changing things up, you're constantly changing, allowing yourself to kind of overload without hitting those plateaus. So that's one thing. The training volume is important as well. So, basically simply put, like volume is going to be, sets times reps times weight, right? Or weight, so if you do 100 pounds and you do 3 sets, that's what 300, and then how many times you do that around. So you kind of something like that. I'm not sure if I said the math right, but you get the point, right? Sets times reps times weight, and then you do that for the entire workout. That's your total kind of training volume. So the amount of weight you're moving over the entire workout needs to be fairly high. That seems to correlate very closely with the strength or size gains. So training volume is important. And generally when it comes to volume with each exercise, you have 3 sets. And then again, we talked about reps. You could do higher reps, so you can do lower reps. And,
Oh yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. And I'm sorry I didn't ask that question earlier. You said you generally do 3 or 4 sets. Why, just briefly, why does doing more seem to not lose its effect?
I
quickly?
don't know. So
But it just
some of the stuff
does?
that I've read, that there seems to be a diminishing returns after three sets of an exercise. But again, and it could just be with you want to change things up. So instead of doing, let's say I want to work my chest, instead of doing 20 sets of bench press, do 3 sets of the bench press, do 3 sets of an incline press, do 3 sets of cable flies, do 3 sets of decline dumbbell fly. So you can, doing 3 sets of different exercises rather than doing one exercise for a bunch of sets seems to have a better effect. And there's some studies that show doing 1 set, has an even better effect. So, but general rule of thumb, 3 sets, maybe 4 if you want to do like a warm up. Anywhere from your 6 to 15 reps, depending on what method you're going to use, and doing 2 to 5 exercises per muscle group seems to be the most effective thing. So again, it varies a little bit. It's going to change depending on how quickly you adapt. So if your biceps adapt great to 2 exercises, great. If you need to do 5 or 6, great. Other rule is just consistency. Consistency is really important. So I think especially when it comes to building muscle, you can't get not you can't, but it's very hard for a lot of people to get away with a good week and then a bad week and then a good week and then 2 bad weeks. You need to be consistent with the lifting in order to really build the right adaptations. Another principle is variation. So in your workout, and over time or over time. So like I said, doing different exercises can be useful. Let's say for some people, they like to do the same workout over the course of 3 months. You can do the same workout over the course of 3 months, increase your weights, but then at some point you got to change things up. So you got to change the exercises. So varying the exercises, whether it's workout to workout, whether it's intra workout, whether it's, over the course of months, variation is an important principle.
So just sort of with keeping within that idea of variation, not that it's too much with variation, but it just made me think about it. People say, I don't like to do any cardio while I'm trying to gain mass because it makes me smaller. Right now, clearly, if you're running marathons, then probably might be a little tricky to gain size. But is there any evidence that doing moderate cardio, which we know is very good for you, in total will hurt your size gains?
No. All right. So next principle. So fatigue. So that this probably should be one. Fatigue seems to be the most important thing. So now it's not necessarily failure. So it's not that you have to train until you to absolute maximum failure, but you need to train. When you're doing an exercise, whether you're doing 6 reps or you're doing 20 reps, you need to do enough that you can't do another rep or 2. That's got to be that's really, really, really important here. So I think I'd say, I probably should have said fatigue first because fatigue is that important. Tied into fatigue is volume. So really volume, fatigue, progressive overload, those are really the things you really want to focus on. The other thing is, as a trainer, and anybody who's listening who's a trainer has always heard time under tension. And so we kind of always learned that time under tension was the biggest principle. So I'd say it is still a principle, but it doesn't seem to be as important as volume and fatigue. So time under tension is basically just as I'm doing my bicep curls, right? My 10 reps, whatever the amount of time it is that I'm under that constant tension of doing the exercise, that would be time under tension. But it seems, now in general, the time under tension is going to kind of correlate with, bringing yourself to fatigue. But like I said, I can do really, really light weights for 25, 30 reps where I could still do more. And if I haven't reached fatigue, I'm not going to get the same training effect as if I get fatigue. So while time under tension kind of correlates with everything else, it's not the most important principle, or at least it doesn't seem to be the most important principle. And they got 2 more things. Basically 2 to 3 times per muscle group per week seems to be the best thing for building size. So, once a week may or may not be the best. I think some people can get away with it, but most people you're going to need to do 2 to 3 times per group per week if you're really trying to put on size. And then the last thing is, another question we didn't really touch on much, but and because I guess this is again a more of a bodybuilding thing and a more specific thing. But do you isolate muscles? Do I isolate my biceps, or do I just work overall larger group muscle groups? And it really depends on the person. So isolation can be really good and useful for weak spots. So again, if you find that certain areas aren't growing faster, then you isolate that area and it should grow faster. But again, it really depends on how you adapt to exercises. So, try to give an overall idea of what it takes to build size. We went way long. In fact, today we were not going to be able to talk about
this. Was a massive episode.
Damn it! I think it deserves that title now. So yeah, I think I covered as much as I needed to cover for this without obviously without going 5 hours. So let us know what you think. As usual, all of our stuff is at thegymwits.com. Check out our social media. Shoot me a message if you thought I missed anything, or if there are any questions, or if you thought I got something wrong, or if you have your own kind of science or anecdotes or anything to share. We always love information. And that is it. I'm Ryan George.
I'm Justin Guild, a.k.a. Chef Sonic, reminding you that truth does not sell.
And we are the GymWits.